You can go ahead, Neil.
Oh, sorry. I lost my, okay, wonderful. Hello, everybody. Welcome to our June meeting for the Environment and Climate Committee. We're just getting started right after 11. It looks like folks are just finally getting on and getting their audio and video set up. So that's looking good. I think let's see, how many people, who's not here? Is anybody good at counting? Of voting numbers? I just didn't want to start the voting on anything or the meeting minutes things if it looks like most of us are here. Okay. You all should have a copy of the agenda. So we can get started first on approving of meeting minutes, and then we'll talk a little bit just about how we're trying to structure the meetings to be a little bit more time efficient and hear everyone's voices, and then we'll jump into public comment and the rest of the agenda, if that sounds good for everybody. Okay, sweet. For the meeting minutes, does everybody have a copy / was everybody able to review the meeting minutes from our meeting in May? Great. Any comments or discussion about those minutes? No? Great. I'd be willing to entertain a motion if somebody is willing to approve those minutes.
A motion to approve.
I'll second.
All right. All in favor, raise your Zoom hand. That's all of us. Oh, me too. And I forgot to call roll, but because I don't have a list in front of me, but I've just counted everybody's hands. So I think everybody's here. Cassie, do you want me to call roll for the group? Or do you have a list?
It's probably good. I can do it since I have a list in front of me right now.
Okay, that'd be great.
Okay, Bill.
Present.
Covey.
Here.
Kelly.
Here.
Kersey.
Here.
Mark.
Here.
Neil.
Here.
Peter.
Is that me? I'm here.
Yeah.
I'm fighting an unstable internet connection at the moment.
Okay. Rory.
Here.
Serena.
Here.
Tess.
Here, and you might see me switch to phone at some point.
Okay. Anne.
Here.
And Sasha. Okay.
All right, thanks for that. I had copied over the agenda and missed the roll call list, but I have the normal meeting packet up now. So great. Well, welcome everybody. I'm glad that we're all able to make it. Things are getting exciting in the ECC. It seems like we're making some serious progress. I wanted to quickly make a comment as we're kind of figuring out how to work as a group in this online world where most of us have never met each other and we're trying to be productive online and hear everyone's voices. Just wanted to make a couple of notes on things that we're going to try to do to make our time together as with the goals of being as efficient as possible, and also with the goal of hearing from as much of the group as possible. So a couple of things that I'm going to do organization-wise with the meeting is we've been doing these long enough that I'll hopefully have a better idea of some time estimates for the agenda items that we're going into, especially some of the info items where if we're not expected to come to a conclusion, we're probably going to limit the amount of discussion because that we'll be diving into the details in between meetings anyways. And so we don't need to flesh out all of those details before making decisions. So that's one thing that we're doing. And then just in the planning, trying to make sure that we have our meetings or our really important decision items, that we have enough time for those. Another thing we have as a group is we have a step up, step back policy that we wanted to revisit. Some of that is on me in terms of meeting facilitation. And then that's also kind of incumbent on the group to try to make sure that we are providing the right space for folks to be able to step up. So I might ask if folks have more time, and really a lot of this comes back as well to having the time to fully hear everyone's voices instead of being rushed. So then we cut off conversation after the first couple of people talk. Also with that, when people comment or raise their hands for comment, I might call on people not in the order that they put their hand up. Are there other items, Kersey? And then just making sure that we're making that space. Kersey, did I miss anything?
No, I think that sounds good. I appreciate you taking the time to think about that over the last month.
Yeah. And we are, we're 2-hour online meetings have never been anybody's forte, I don't think, but I think we're doing pretty good. So with that, we can jump next to the next item in the agenda, which is public comment. I don't see any attendees or anybody outside of panelists that are in this meeting to make public comment, unless I'm missing something.
No, I don't see any either. I'm a little concerned that maybe something is not working with the link, because there were a couple of people I was expecting to be on as attendees, but I haven't received any emails from anyone saying they are having a hard time getting on. So
if they come in, I'd be if there was a connection problem and there's a time where folks join afterwards, we might move this to later in the meeting, or ask for those comments if they're watching the recording afterwards or watching on YouTube. Feel free to share those comments with the group after the meeting, and we will be sure to look at all of those. So next item on the agenda are updates from Cassie.
Okay, let me just try to pull up one slide. I'm on a bit of a different setup today, so bear with me for a moment. Okay. Yeah, so some updates from for you all is that the city council did move forward with your recommendation on the oil by rail resolution, and they adopted the resolution on June 2nd, 2021. After the last meeting, we had Neil and Mark presented to the city council in a work session about your recommendations, and there was a little bit of discussion, and then we went back at the next meeting and they actually moved forward and adopted that resolution pretty much in the form that you all recommended it. The one thing that was added was that there was some comments we received after the meeting about kind of how to define oil, so that it encompassed other types of hazardous fossil fuels that we were concerned about, such as liquefied natural gas. And so what we did is, in the final resolution, we defined oil by the definition in House Bill 2209, I think it was called, which just describes kind of a broader but still specific set of fossil fuels that are covered under oil. So great work on that. That's kind of your first big move that was moved forward by the council. So it's exciting. And then other update is just a reminder that I did get those public evaluation subgroup meetings rescheduled. They're going to occur on the weeks of June 21st and 28th. So as a reminder, at the end of this meeting, once we decide on the evaluation criteria, we're going to send you all the Excel document that is that tool that we looked at the last meeting. And I'm asking for those to be returned by end of the day, Thursday, June 17th, which is 1 week. And the reason I need them back kind of quickly like that is because the first subcommittee meeting happens just 4 or 5 days after that. And so I need to have a day to kind of compile all of your information for those meetings and then get them posted online before those meetings begin. And so just as a reminder of what that evaluation process is going to look like during those subgroup meetings, because that is the next time that you all will see each other in your small groups. They'll be over Zoom, and so you'll all get your evaluation documents to me, that spreadsheet, by next Thursday. And then I'm going to compile the scores for each subgroup. So when I come to that meeting, I'll show, so it's transparent. This was Neil's score, this was Bill's score, this was Tessa's score, on like a slide deck so that the public can kind of see this is how everyone ranked everything. And then I'll add them up so that we have kind of a net prioritization based on your individual scores. And that will just be the starting point of the discussion. And then for those meetings, we'll allow each subgroup member to have 5 or up to 10 minutes, depending on how many people are in your group, to share kind of your justification, your priorities, kind of what went into your decision making. And then we'll hold like an hour. I mean, they're scheduled for 2 hours, so potentially we have more time than that. But have about an hour for you all to just deliberate amongst yourselves and decide if you want to move, like what you want that list to look like. So on the one hand, you could say, I want to stay with kind of our net scores and move ahead with that prioritized list. But I think oftentimes you look at the prioritized list and there might be a decision to talk it out in the small group and say, I know this one came up first, but actually for these reasons, I think we should move this one up. So that's the type of discussion you'll be able to have with each other. So they're kind of loose in form so that you all can just have an open discussion about it. With just a little bit of that structure to start off the discussion. Does that process make sense for everyone and seem like it'll work okay? Okay. And then let's visit the timeline quickly again. So like I said, we have not updated the months here, so we're off a month now, but the steps are still the same. So where we're at right now is, for today is what was scheduled to happen in May. So our first step is that we want to finalize our prioritization criteria and actually vote for that prioritization criteria. So that's the primary goal for today's meeting. And we'll make sure that whatever that final prioritization criteria is, will go into that Excel doc that we'll send out. And then if we have time today, we thought we'd start discussing kind of the approach for evaluating and the CCAP strategies, like how to prioritize, because we'll come back to the next meeting with the subgroup prioritization, but we'll need to get to a point where we're narrowing that down to a prioritized list across all the subgroups for the council. So if we have time for that today, we'll start talking about that. The next meeting, which will be in July, we'll have each of the subgroup leads will share out from your evaluation meeting. And then we'll have a discussion. It'll be kind of an opportunity for the group to just express some initial thoughts on kind of what the top priorities are and how that's shaping up. And we'll probably have a bigger conversation about how do we want to move forward from here now that we know everyone's priorities. Then we have another month, which will probably be in August, where we had a whole month of just not needing to come to a decision, but having the whole purpose of that meeting to just discuss the prioritized strategies, continue to work on how are we going to come to a final decision on this. And then the following month, which would be September, would be hopefully when you can actually come to a vote on them. So it's a little bit flexible. So it's possible that the kind of what we have for July and August here might be able to happen in one meeting. If we need to stretch it out, there's not really a super firm timeline, but those are kind of the steps. You got your individual evaluations, bring those to the full group. Then the full group needs to decide how they need to prioritize amongst those that kind of prioritize that from the subgroups. You all need to determine kind of what you want to bring forward to the council. So we need to discuss how we want to do that and then actually do that. And then following that, whether we're in September or October, we'll have a presentation to the city council to say, hey, these are the things that we recommend moving forward with this biennium, which hopefully then get the council's feedback, but also potentially get their go ahead to move forward with some of them. And that will likely take place in a council subcommittee meeting. But we have, I think we're still determining that as well. So any questions on that? Mark?
Yeah, in terms of what we actually want to present to the council, do we want to have something more detailed than just say the names and the descriptions of any particular item from the CCAP? I'm wondering if we want to be giving them some advice or start to think about what that process looks like in a practical way. I'm wondering how much detail do you think we should try to, as a group, strive for with that priority?
I think if you're at the point where you have more detail about how to move forward, I think it's a good idea to do that. I think you can kind of use the time as whatever would be most helpful to help get the group oriented to move forward. So I think that would be a good idea. It would probably, that's something we can discuss kind of as we move forward and figure out what that prioritization is going to be, like what else we want to talk to the council about during that opportunity. Any other questions about the process? Okay, I don't see any. And then the one last update, I didn't write it down, but there's definitely been, I know there's been more and more questions about moving on from a virtual environment. And so just to kind of let you know where the city's at, the city council has started doing in-person meetings, but they're still very limited. They just have the city councilors there. They don't have staff there yet. So we're kind of in a hybrid space right now. Moving forward, we're going to bring back all staff to the office starting about September. So we're kind of giving everyone the summer and then aligned with the new school year, kind of returning to a little bit more of a normal setup. And so there haven't been any decisions specifically made about what advisory committees need to do and when they need to do it. But I think, so that's something for you all to think about. I think there will be the option for committees, I think, of staying virtual if you prefer, if that's easier, or coming to doing some in-person meetings, or perhaps the group wants to explore some type of hybrid option. We don't have good technology for doing like a half people at home, half people in person. We may be able to talk about what those options are, but I think we have a couple of months until we're realistically likely going to meet in person. But I do think if you all wanted to, it could happen as soon as later this summer or the fall. So that's something that we can revisit. I know that as far as scheduling goes, moving to in-person might have different implications for people with what their availability is and that kind of thing. So I don't have any like firm answers on that right now, but I just wanted to let you know that the city's kind of slowly moving. Yeah.
Just a quick update. Hi, everybody. This is Mary. Just this morning at the leadership meeting, and I haven't had a chance to, it just ended at 10:30. There was this question from CDD and the Planning Commission, because some groups are starting to want to meet in person. And this is an evolving topic because the state keeps changing and not giving us clarity on what the state emergency order is going to say and what the kind of state guidance is going to be on vaccination, masks, that whole arena. But what Eric said this morning is that, as Cassie just told you, council is starting to hold hybrid meetings. The first committee to hold a hybrid meeting will be the Planning Commission. And that will probably be in July because they hold quasi-judicial hearings, but it will just be them and not the public. What Eric just said this morning is we will start talking to our boards and other boards and commissions in September for the potential first in-person meeting, whether the public can attend or whether that would still be virtual. I'm just updating the council rules, but we already have in our rules the ability to hold meetings that are attended virtually by the public. So we just need to see, and we haven't decided whether there'll be a city policy or if each group can decide how they want to hold it. We probably want some consistency for the public so that they know how our boards and committees and commissions meeting. But September is probably the first meeting you'd be thinking about it. It's the latest. Although this could change depending on what happens at the state level. You know, we're all trying to get to that 70% vaccination rate, and it's really close right now. So sorry for interrupting. I just that just
thanks,
came
Sarah.
out
That's
this
really
morning.
helpful. Yeah, and I doubt things could change, but I think it'd be hard for us to move sooner than September, just because there's only 2 meetings between now and then. But anyway, so that's where we're at. And thank you, Mary, for that extra info.
Yep.
And with that, that's all the updates from me. So I'll turn it back over to Neil.
Great. Thanks. And our next section is the bike rack. Also in the bike rack, planning on talking a little bit about some of the additional public comment that we got, or just adding that to the bike rack. And as promised, we have about 10 minutes for the bike rack, which would put us a little bit after 11:30, which is just about on schedule. Sorry, Serena, that's the bike rack for you?
Oh, is it me? I'm sorry. I thought you were doing bike rack today.
Oh, I can do bike rack.
It doesn't really matter.
Why don't you go ahead and do it if that's okay?
Okay. Well, a couple things, as Neil just mentioned. One of the things we wanted to talk through, obviously, I think at this point, you guys understand what the bike rack is and what it does. Based on our last meeting, there was several things here added. Ideally, if there's anything time sensitive, we would also kind of put a date on it, so we have a better idea of what we need in terms of, planning for agenda going forward. The other thing we should talk about a little bit more, because there was some questions that came up over the last couple days. As public comments are coming in an email, how do we potentially bring them to an agenda item, and like what that timeline looks like? So based on our laws and our documentation, that we have anything up to a week before the meeting, we can kind of propose. Neil, Cassie, and I meet usually a week and a half before we have to put out a good week before we have to put out the agenda to everyone. So if there are things that come up, please reach out and let us know, and we'll do our best timely to accommodate those requests. Anything between that week where we have sent out the agenda and the meeting, it's kind of pretty much fixed unless there's any, I guess, urgent emergency type thing that we need to probably discuss. But for the most part, that's kind of the process. And I wanted to just talk through that and ask if you guys had any questions and maybe any thoughts on how we could better address that going forward. And then we'll kind of get into the public comment and the bike racks itself. So. Yes, Kelly? Yeah, I think this is probably a separate topic, but I just also wanted to address how we respond to letters or emails as they come in. I know as someone who's sent those to other organizations or committees, it drives me crazy when I don't know if it's been received or if it's being considered. And then just to keep, so from an engagement perspective, making sure that we're keeping people engaged, and then also how we move to the agenda. And I don't have any questions on that. It seems straightforward. Thank you. Kavi?
I just had a question regarding, I think what you mentioned, Serena, about if something urgent or like an emergency thing came up. Is there an option or a pathway for something like that if it comes up in the future, or is that already set in our rules, or do we need to consider that?
That's Cassie or potentially Mary question. I guess, anything urgent between a week of that week that we would need to adjust?
Well, the main challenge that I see, I think it depends a little bit on the nature of what it is, but the main challenge I see is that if we have something that comes up a day or 2 days before the meeting, there's just no time to put together a reasonable background information to get educated on the topic. Like, there's not really enough time to prepare in order for the committee to come to any type of meaningful decision like 24 to 48 hours later. So from just kind of like a practical perspective, that's the biggest challenge that I see. And I think that we risk things coming up as emergencies and then spending a lot of time on them in meetings and them either not being actionable or just not having the right information we need to move forward. And our agendas so far have been very, very full. So if we want to put something on, we would have to take something off, and not having time to even talk with the chairs of the committee about what are we comfortable taking off. And also part of the reason for bringing up agenda items beforehand is because typically, like for the council, if they want to add something to an agenda, like they want to talk about a topic, they need to make sure that a majority of the council also wants to talk about that topic. So that's kind of why you do it. Ideally, you can do it at the meeting before so that we can say, okay, someone wants to talk about this topic. Do a majority of people want to talk about it? Because that way we can prevent someone coming in saying this is an emergency, but if it's only an emergency for one of the committee members, that's not necessarily a fair use of time for the rest of the committee. So that's why the month ahead is kind of still the best option. And we built in that 1 week before for that time sensitive thing. If something is literally within days, it seems practically very hard to pull off a meaningful conversation. And then my question for Mary was, if someone had an agenda item they wanted to add like 24 hours before, and say we felt like there was a strong justification for talking about that, but it wasn't something that we put on the agenda as, hey, we're going to talk about this. Are there any type of rules as far as like the notice we give the public about what we're going to talk about, or is that not really covered in our notice requirements?
Yeah, the notice isn't we post agendas to give notice, but sometimes things come up that aren't exactly on the agenda. If there was something that you felt like, I would say, I'm trying to pull up your guidelines really fast. I mean, they're your guidelines, how you decided to run your meeting, so you can always change them. But Cassie's exactly right. This has been a debated topic with council and councilors trying to get things, in at the last minute, and it really being hard to manage for the chair and the staff. I would say if there's something that you all really want to talk about and it is extremely time sensitive, at the beginning of your meeting, you would need to have a motion. The chair would have to get, consensus from a majority of you, and then you would amend the agenda. So at least any public watching knows that you've changed your agenda and added something. I mean, that's pretty unusual for a body that is a recommendation body, that you don't have time. But I can maybe envision if there was something time sensitive that you really needed to get a recommendation to council at its next meeting, and you didn't have any other time to look at a particular topic. That might be the unique scenario where you'd need to amend your agenda.
Remember, it's just kind of challenging for a group like this that's bound by 2 hours, but if a council does it, they have the ability to run their meeting for 6-7 hours to get through everything. And you all don't really have that same flexibility. So if it takes 10 minutes of discussion to add it to the agenda, and then you have to cut something else off, it's just some of those kind of practical things to keep in mind. But that's a good suggestion, Mary, that there is.
Yeah, you would amend the agenda. And responding to, that there are definitely community members that are watching what you are doing, but there are also topics that are very important to the community right now that, activists are going to different committees and commissions. And I would just encourage you to step back and not be reactive to things that you don't have background on. That's exactly what Cassie is talking about. You cannot make good decisions if you don't have background. And some of the issues that might be brought to you would take bringing in other departments to educate you on a lot of knowledge that you don't have. So if you're not only is it that agenda, it might be future agendas that you're trying to adjust. That's why you try to be a little more deliberative and within the roles that council gave you, while being responsive to the community members on those topics. So again, I would just ask you to exercise a little caution on reacting to everything that gets brought to you.
Thank you. That information has been really helpful. Kirsty, did you have a question?
Yeah, I agree with what Mary's saying. So maybe during our bike rack discussion, if there's something that's urgent, this would be when we could say, I'd like to either add it or try to amend our present agenda. And then I'd like to also echo what Kelly was saying about the email response. And so maybe it's something we put on the bike rack to discuss next month for a couple minutes of just assigning a protocol to respond to those emails.
Yep, thank you. And that is something we talked about in the past, and we've been slowly kind of working through all these like intricacies, right, of how the board or how our committee is working. So I appreciate that thought process, and yeah, let's make a note to add that to the bike rack for a future agenda. I mean, we've been, as public comments and things are coming in, we've been putting them on the bike rack, but there's definitely that communication back and forth, right, that we haven't really addressed yet to let people know that we've been hearing them and seeing what they have to say, and that we do want to respond in some sort of manner. So,
and as a reminder, the system that we set up initially when we were doing the guidelines and principles is that, well, it was modified a little bit with the introduction of the bike rack, but the bike rack is kind of that parking lot list. But at the end of the meeting, in every single meeting, we have this agenda setting time. And so that's the time if you want to say, the bike rack is like things we'll get to someday or things we'd like to not forget about. And then in the agenda setting time at the end of the meeting, that's the time to say, I would like to talk about, so if we want to talk about how to respond to emails at the next meeting, then I would recommend that someone, when we do agenda setting, says, can we add that as a discussion topic for the next meeting? And then a good practice is to kind of take like a quick just raise of hands to say, do a majority of us want to spend time at the next meeting on that topic? And you can do that with like process stuff like that makes sense. I imagine most people are interested in talking about that. But if you want to talk about a specific topic that's on the bike rack, if someone says, hey, I really, really want to start the conversation about a climate emergency declaration, then at the end of the meeting, you could say, I'd like to do that at the next meeting, or you could even say, can we plan on doing that in October or something, like propose a future meeting. So it's kind of a two-step process where we have the waiting area for things we want to talk about, but then we also built in a process to actually move it to an agenda so that we don't just get this long list of things that we never talk about.
No, thank you for that reminder, Cassie. We've been so stacked with time. We haven't quite had that process to work through as much. So that's a good reminder.
And speaking of time, we are at the time that we had wanted for the bike rack today. So
yes. So last, does anyone have any additional items they want to add to the bike rack that they've seen over the last month since our last meeting that they want to put on as a potential agenda item for future reference? Kelly?
I don't know if it's on the COID, the emails that we've been receiving. I'd like to add that.
Thank you.
A question on that, Kelly. Did you want to try and bring it up in the next meeting, or is that more of a future?
I think it's next meeting, if possible, if we can add that in. I don't know what the development timeline is for that, but I've been hearing quite a bit of discussion and churn about this development.
We'll add it to the bike rack and readdress options for agenda setting at the end of the meeting.
Perfect.
Okay. I think I'll hand it back over to Neil.
Sorry, really quick, I just want to add, if we have time at the end of the meeting, we can, I do want to make sure we have as much time as we need for the evaluation criteria and constraints, but we can maybe answer some questions that some of you were raising about timelines and what, some questions about that project in particular, because I know you got a lot of emails about it, but let's do that at the end if we have time.
Perfect. So the next section on the agenda is the updated evaluation criteria and constraints. And this is something that we are taking action on today. So we're hoping to adopt these. A reminder, at the last meeting, we had some really robust discussion and then asked some folks offline to be able to consolidate some of those ideas, provide some definitions, just so we had a little bit more clarity of what exactly we were deciding on, and thinking forward to make sure that we were looking and evaluating each of the criteria as similarly as possible to each other, so we weren't seeing them as different things. So Covey, Kelly, and Kersey, which they were not chosen because of the alliteration, but they worked on that and are going to present, I think, what they came up with to start the conversation. And this is the bulk of the meeting. We have this scheduled to take close to an hour. And Serena will lead the discussion afterwards.
Okay, great. Cassie, do you want to bring that up?
Yes, I can bring up, someone else did that.
I think I've got it.
Perfect.
Is this what you're talking about?
Yep.
Okay, just tell me where you want.
I think there's fine. I'm not going to read through it. Hoping you all had the chance to do that, and then we can do that through our discussion, but just wanted to give you an update of what we did and more of our process. So we talked through the different criteria and decided to include definition and an evaluation question to help really get really clear so that we're all evaluating these the action items as similarly as possible. So just wanted to provide a lot of information here. So using definitions that the three of us kind of put our heads together to figure out the best definition as it relates to the CCAP, and then putting in a question to really provide some narrow framing about how to look at the criteria and the constraints. We did do some combining, if you want to scroll down, and created some new names for criteria as we were defining, changing the term to better fit that definition of what we were really trying to get to. And then took in a lot of your feedback, especially about affordable living, affordability, to really define that so that people are looking at this, they understand what we're talking about specifically. And then we changed low-hanging fruit. We kept saying that, or like, well, could we just make that the title? So that's where that came from. And then we did leave separate constraints. Let's see, so really trying to talk about keeping like funding separate from resources. So resources meaning more about staff time. So trying to separate things out, and did the same thing in the criteria for greenhouse gases versus other resources or other benefits. So trying to be really specific here. But with that, I'll turn it back over to Serena, and we can just have an open discussion and go through each of these.
Yeah, so I think it would help to just start at the beginning, do a line item, read through each one and have a discussion and see if there's any concerns or other thoughts that we might want to bring into that definition or question. And then after we do each of those, if there's anyone who wants to bring up a potential new constraint or a new evaluation criteria that we should discuss, we can have that discussion as well. And then at the same time, we would also have to create a definition and a question for that potentially new topic. And then from there, I just want to remind everyone, our goal today is to be able to vote these in so we can utilize them in the criteria that we need to do over the next week to send out to Cassie. Neil.
I think, Cassie, were you going to take notes, just process-wise, take notes on the changes? So then we can kind of get a head nod of being in the right spot and then vote at one time all the amendments together. So just so folks know that. Do you want to have those open while we're going, Cassie, and share your screen, or do you want the static version to be shared?
Yeah, I can do. Would that be easier for everyone if we can all kind of look at it as we go along? Okay.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure. Let me just make sure I have the right.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder, Neil. So does anyone from the smaller group that created these, does anyone want to take on the questions or the criteria individually, or do you want me to just read through them? I can read through them. I just want to make sure, I mean, you guys did a lot of the work on this, so I just want to make sure that, you know, what your thought processes and everything are coming through properly. All right, so the first evaluation criteria that we're going to look at is equity. The definition that is being stated here refers to the distribution of time, resources, and focus in a way that counteracts disparities to create equal access and outcomes. And this is this is referring to the DEI task force report from Bend City Council. And the question that you have to ask yourself when you're evaluating under this criteria is, what is the impact of this action on equity for community members? I'm going to open up the floor and people can raise their hand and talk through any questions, concerns. Rory?
With this one, I wonder a little bit how we will measure or determine equity as we consider the actions before us. Some of the other ones are a lot easier, like greenhouse gas reduction, the most obvious because we already have a number in the CCAP for most of these. But this one and maybe a couple of the others, so you know, maybe this is more of a general comment, but it applies to equities. I worry a little bit of how we can objectively, evaluate the actions under this criteria.
Does anyone have any thoughts on that, what Rory brought up? Mark, I saw you kind of raise your hand.
Yeah, I was going to let anyone else speak if anyone else want to say first. Just because I do end up doing this in our work quite a bit, and I know it's a relatively narrow approach, but if we're identifying specific groups when we can, where we can think about the distribution of benefits and costs and think about how the benefits and costs align, especially for groups that are seen as historically disadvantaged or BIPOC or the like. So I totally agree, Roy. It's quite difficult. And from my perspective, it's almost sort of this disaggregated benefit cost analysis. And ideally, there's a historic view in terms of how they've come to the position where they are and what that particular benefit or cost has been like for them in the past. So I know that, and there's certainly more to it than that, but it seems like it'd be interesting for the group to think if, and maybe even ask Cassie, where we can identify disaggregated distributions of benefits or costs. I don't know if others have encountered this in different ways.
Yeah, thanks, Mark. And there's definitely like census demographic data at the most basic level that can help inform evaluating equity. But yeah, I guess I would pose the same question quickly to Cassie. Like, do you know if the city in other decision making has used tools to evaluate equity impacts?
It's a good question. I mean, I would say we have used in the past basic demographic data, and typically it's been used in like transportation infrastructure decisions. So it's usually like a GIS kind of mapping, and that's what we've been talking about. It's a huge, huge topic for us now, and we're trying to figure out how we can do it. I think there's a lot of people in that place right now. So during this biennium, we have a pretty major project about doing like equity mapping and having some kind of equity index for the city to help make decisions. We do not have something like standard ready for, that the city is kind of using at this time. It's definitely like a pretty big one that we're trying to think really hard about. The other thing too is that I think it can be hard because for each action, kind of like you're saying, it's disaggregated, like the relevant data and information it's completely different. It can be completely different for each action. Certainly at least each kind of category area. So it's not data we really have. One thing I will say is that I actually did include in the budget for this biennium, I did include a subscription to this kind of new like software service that shows maps of our energy burden in Bend. It's not like amazing data. There's basically four kind of blocks that shows who has a higher energy burden and a lower energy burden. So that's kind of one cool piece that we have. And we do have like some static maps from the city to help make decisions about, demographic data across the community.
Thank you, Cassie. Neil?
I'll just also comment, kind of related to Mark's comment earlier about, beyond the title of these suggestions on implementation, I see a lot of the actions in the CCAP as potentially doing a really good job or a really bad job in all of these categories as well. And so I don't know how, I think because we are making suggestions that we can interpret our best version of these actions and then make sure to suggest those. So like, specific distribution and these maps of energy burden and other equity maps might not really be that applicable when you're talking about something super broad. But then when we say we really like this criteria and council, when you adopt it, we want to make sure that it's incorporating XYZ, then that would be, or highlights these things. That seems to me as how I'm planning on evaluating is kind of both grading it and also communicating that as a topic that I feel like I know pretty well, communicating that to the rest of the group of where I think it can go and how it would fit in an ideal implementation.
That makes a lot of sense, Neil. Thank you. That's a good way to think about it. I'm going to call on Mary.
Oh, hi, thank you. I just had a thought. We've just started the Human Rights and Equity Commission, and they've only had 2 meetings, but I think I would encourage, your role is very specific to climate, but it reminds me a little of the discussion that we had with transportation and facilities impact on different communities. And I think I would just encourage you to maybe reach out to maybe have some joint board discussion to see what their thoughts are on this topic, both for consistency in the city and just because they're the new group that we've asked to help us with these topics. So that's just a thought as you think about this evaluation criteria, to get their thoughts on it. If you haven't watched any of their meetings, it's a pretty diverse group from different aspects of Bend.
It's a good point. I have chatted with one woman who is on that committee, but not specifically on this topic in general. That's definitely a good point to continue to think about those resources as we're working through these criterias and what we can utilize down the road. Bill?
Yeah, I think it's a good question that got raised, but I think as I'm going through the criteria and individually, if I look at each of the strategies, I think I can make at least a qualitative call on whether an action looks equity or not. I'm looking at the energy buildings. Okay, doing code stuff. Well,
is anyone else losing Bill?
Probably it's going to have less impact on equity. Huh? I'm unmuted.
Yeah, I think we're just having some small
connection
disconnect.
Okay. No, I'll be real short on it. Basically, it looks like some of the actions I can make a qualitative call on it. Like code's probably less equity, but promoting energy efficiency incentives, well, you can come up with limited income programs and reach out to different groups, and that one probably can. I would give it, if it was 1 to 5, I'd give that one a higher score, the code one the lower one. And I don't think the fact that we don't have real hard and fast data and criteria to measure it with is going to limit me from making a call on equity when we're trying to prioritize.
Great. Yeah, this has been a really good discussion because some of this is going to kind of overlay in every of these categories, right? So kind of to what Neil and to what Bill has been saying is, we'll individually rank as we see fit based on the information that we've done to date, the research we've done to date, with the idea that we'll also say, yes, this is a priority based on how we want to, and then expectations or recommendations with that part of criteria and how we're pushing out those strategies. So it's part of your reasoning, right? You scored this with this number with the expectation or assumption of this, if that makes sense. Neil had a much better way of saying it than I did. So we're still on equity. We've had a lot of really great discussion and reminders of certain resources that will come to play with time. Is there any request for changing or updating any language, or do we feel comfortable with how it sits now to do the evaluation process on equity? Bill, your hand is still raised. I don't know if you want
to raise it just because I was going to ask what you just said. Are we going to have just kind of a show of hands on, or are we going to vote on them?
Yeah, I guess I was just opening up the floor if anyone has anything they want changed, and if not, we'll vote, I think, at the end on the document as a whole. But I'm asking about equity specifically at this moment, if there's any requests for changes. And I will count to 10. Okay, well, it sounds like at this point we feel comfortable with the language and how we're going to personally evaluate these going forward for equity. So let's move on to greenhouse gas reduction. The definition leads to a decrease in emissions of gases that causes climate change by absorbing and emitting radiant energy, causing the greenhouse effect in Earth's atmosphere. And the question to pose to yourself: what is the impact of this action on greenhouse gas reduction? Now, I think we all can probably agree this might be a little bit more straightforward than some of these other criteria. They're all just as important. So I'm gonna, again, open it up to comments, questions, concerns. Mark?
Yeah, I'll just say quickly, I like how it's set up, and I like that we have the opportunity to interpret it a bit on our own, but I realize that personally, I'm going to think in terms of the total amount of greenhouse gas reduction potential, the efficiency in terms of the per unit reduction per cost, and maybe also the equity, sort of is this a strategy that is doing it in an equitable way? So I don't know if others have other ways they might think about interpreting how you'll apply this in one sense, because understandably everything on our list is leading to some reduction, I'm sure.
No, that's a good thought process. I appreciate that. Any comments on that or other considerations? Okay. We're going to move on then to a category that is now called low-hanging fruit. Most of us have used this language in different sorts. The definition being told here can be implemented relatively quickly and/or doesn't require a lot of resources or effort. So the question to pose: can this action be completed quickly and/or and or with low resources or effort. Basically, this is again kind of interpretation of what quick and low resource or low effort is. But in general, in comparison to all the strategies, I would, there's probably some outliers that make sense in this category and how that feels. I'm going to open up the floor again and ask if anyone has thoughts or questions about this topic. Covey?
I have a very small nitpicky thing, but just adding a hyphen between low and hanging. If everyone's okay with that.
Perfect. Last call on this one. If there's any thoughts, again, fairly straightforward in terms of concept. All right, we're going to move to long-term progress. The definition here: leads to advancements, infrastructure, cultural behavior change, and operational that lead to outcomes that are sustained and have long-term impact. Does this action facilitate long-term progress? So somewhat opposite of the low-hanging fruit. Bill?
One of the ways I thought about this originally too was where an action actually allows us to do other actions. So that creates long-term progress. So if it's like this, if we do this, then these other actions are enabled. So I think I tried to figure out where that folded in, and I think it probably folds into this one as much as anything else in the definition. It's not in the definition, but I think it's part of this one. For example, electrification of the electric grid helps the electrification of the transportation options. So that's the long-term, it's helping long-term progress.
Just a clarifying question, Bill, is that distinct from the avoiding missed opportunities one that was also added?
Where is that one?
It's at here.
Missed opportunities?
Yeah, that was the one that we added
Yeah, that was mine.
to the list.
No, I think it is different. This is one where something missed opportunities, I always felt like was something where something comes up that if you don't act on it now, you'll lose it, versus something that enables other future actions is supporting long-term progress. I mean, I think there's a pretty big distinction, pretty clear distinction there, actually. Anyway, it's in there. It isn't in the definition, but I think that also is one piece of long-term progress. And I don't know that we need to add it, but it's supporting long-term it's leading to outcomes that are sustained. So I don't think we need to change anything, but when I think about it, I'm going to think about it that way.
Okay, thank you, Bill. Tess?
Yeah, just in regards to Bill's comment, the word that comes to mind is catalyst.
Mm-hmm.
Does that capture it, Bill? It's like it's something that happens that's catalyzing to other actions down the road. So I don't know if that helps.
Leads to advancements. Yep. How do you guys feel about that update? Kind of encompasses the thought process.
I think we'll have to change the wording after from like not lead to like for, maybe as a catalyst for outcomes. I don't know if that goes better together.
Generate outcomes.
And maybe we might have to add or as a catalyst after infrastructure. I don't know, after the
The parenthetic
3
part.
examples.
Leads to advancements or is a catalyst to generate outcomes.
I'm trying to be good and not jump in, but I was thinking about the word enables. Enables out. Yeah, it's an enabler.
Instead of generate, or?
It leads to or enables outcomes that are sustained and have long-term yeah. I think you can leave leads to and or enables. That was where I was thinking about the enabling thing is what I was really thinking about when I made my original comment.
Okay.
Does catalyst capture that? They feel like synonyms to
It does.
me.
It's fine. I think it's fine. Just as long as we get that thought in there, I think it's good.
Okay.
Yeah. I don't think we have to beat it to death.
Yeah. Well, we've captured that idea, which
Thank you.
was great to bring up because it's, it's good that we're kind of seeing how everyone's mind is generating these processes. I'm gonna do another 10-second count and see if does anyone have any other thoughts or concerns about this one before we move on. Yes, Covey.
Quick question on the infrastructure, cultural behavior change and operational. Are those examples of advancements? If so, should we move them right after advancements? Or is that an example of both advancements and catalysts?
I think it could be broad.
Okay.
I think it could apply to both.
That's just me personally, how I'm reading it. All right, let's move on to affordable living and affordability. The definition: to reduce costs of living, housing, energy burden, transportation costs, etc. The question to pose: does this action create and maintain an affordable cost of living? Does it lead to overall reduction in cost of living over time? Tess?
Yeah, it's more of a question. I just wanted to see where folks' heads are at and see if we're talking about cost of living generally for the community as a whole, or are folks trying to think about this on an individual basis? The people that implement these things or benefit from this program will have lower costs of living. And I would be inclined towards the general, but I'd like to hear what other folks are thinking.
No.
It's a great question, because when we would develop programs like solar programs or conservation programs, we'd have to look at it from both aspects. Participants, so if you put a solar water heating or put a PV panel on your roof, it's going to lower your costs. But what does it do for all ratepayers? In this case, it's all the citizens of Bend. And what's the time frame? Is it a 20-year time frame? Is it a short-term time frame? Those are the same kind of questions that it's a little vague. I think we need to think about. It's a really good question, Tess. Which way do we want to look at it, or do we look at it both ways?
Hey, Cassie, can you remind me in our co-benefits on the CCAP how we defined the affordability as being to the resident, correct?
Yeah, I recall it being like more individual, like that.
Yeah, so that's how I've been thinking about it on my end. And it's good that we're seeing that, there's differences in how people are viewing it. So I think it might be a good idea to maybe further define it in that specific way, whichever way that makes sense to everybody. In my mind, reducing the cost of living for me as a person living in a house or living in an apartment or wherever that is, and how my daily cost of living is being affected. That's how I'm thinking about it. I'll open up the floor to anyone else that has thoughts or I guess requests on how we should potentially look, maybe further define this a little bit. Neil?
I think both areas are really important, but I think at a certain level, our level of analysis is going to be really challenging to understand the broad level of it. So I would be open to those interpretations in individual evaluations. And, if somebody does feel like they have a good argument or understanding that something would decrease costs for one group of community members and increase costs for another, I think that's a valuable conversation to have in how you weight this or how you score this. But for a lot of categories, I think that's going to be likely a challenging analysis to just guess. That's kind of where I'm at. If somebody does have that information and wants to share it, that sounds great, but I think it's going to be challenging on a lot of these on an individual basis.
Peter? Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, hopefully you can hear me. My internet situation's been very frustrating. I have been listening and tuning in I was wondering, as I read through these, because I had some concerns with this one as well, because I've seen this argument used to work against what I would consider sustainability issues. So a thought I had is, what if we got rid of this one altogether and nested it within equity?
It's a good question. I'm gonna let's see what Rory has to say, and then we'll call on Kirsty and see if that brings back the question that Peter posed. Rory?
Yeah, thanks. Quickly to respond to Peter, I actually think they should be separate. And I think if we think of it in the way that Tess originally framed it as, is this individual or is it community? And then Neil kind of summed up, well, it should be both, and we can't measure that, with precision. But if we consider both, like, we should be able to use this criteria appropriately. And then the other thing I wanted to say is kind of along those lines. I think at the scale of a city, it will be easiest for us to think about this on an individual level, because as far as community impact, there's so many things out of our control, like utility rates are set by the PUC, and it'll be a lot harder to measure like community-wide affordability or have an effect on community-wide affordability. So I think we're a little bit stuck with thinking about individual impacts. But to your point, Peter, like, we shouldn't let that stop the community-wide progress that I also hope that this criteria encompasses.
Percy?
Yeah, I would second keeping that separate from equity, because I don't want to limit the scope of equity. But I thought a lot about this while we were writing this out of, this is where we butt heads with sustainability and cost of living. So the word that keeps coming into my head is this systemic, like to Neil's point of like reducing cost of living for individual residents, but that might potentially mean that other residents with higher income they need to pay more. So that's a systemic issue that's like community wide. So maybe adding some clarity to the definition that, the benefactors are the residents of Bend, and recognizing that this is on a whole systemic level. And then in the recommendations we make that stand that we do believe that creating more sustainable living does bring cost of living down. And having to back up that argument. And I know you have a lot more experience in that, Peter, so I'm interested to hear more.
And it can be the situation where a short term, it may cost more in the short term to get to the long-term place where it is more affordable. So just a one tiny example that's a part of my experience is it is just cheaper right now in the current reality to heat with natural gas. So how does that factor in with our environmental, and climate mandate? Over time, that would definitely change, but that's where we are right now. So it's one thing I have to wrestle with all the time.
So a lot of really good comments here, conversations. I want to kind of, maybe we can ask Cassie to bring up the cursor and adapt based on what Kirsty was just saying. And if I can call you back, Kirsty, to maybe phrase this in a way that we are adding that consideration.
Sure, like reduces cost of living.
Definition, or?
I think the definition, and then maybe just starting there. So after the parentheses, adding for residents within the city of Bend.
I just want to make sure also that I say that I appreciate the effort and your ability to wrestle with this, because it's not easy and you've done it. So I don't mean in any way to be negative about it. I appreciate what you're doing. I just want to make sure that we don't get caught later down the road.
Oh yeah, I mean, I think this is the crux of so many challenges of trying to live sustainably. Buying organic food is more expensive. Yeah, it comes up a lot. Yeah, and then we could leave it there. We could expand, kind of acknowledging that, with the natural gas example, that there are so many solutions of people at a certain low income level then get a stipend. So kind of acknowledging that changes need to be made on a systemic level in order to make this happen, and not necessarily on an individual having to spend more initially.
Yeah. So
I did want to comment on in the overtime. I think we tried to capture, like Peter, your example about the natural gas heating, like does it lead to an overall reduction in cost of living over time without that time period not being defined necessarily? So that adding that second question was partially to get at that. I don't know if it does or not.
Yeah.
And I think maybe over time needs to be in the definition. I think it's that important.
For residents within the city of Bend over time.
Or over time, after reduces cost over time for the city. Yeah, I think you got to have it, because some things are going to be in the short term. They're going to go boom, but if you look at them over time, they'll like a natural gas tariff. I mean, if there's a tax on it, there you go. Okay, so that's enough.
All right, so I'm going to open up the floor again and ask if anyone has any questions or thoughts on the changes made to this category specifically to date.
I had a quick one.
Yes.
The overtime part. I think I understand the reason for adding that. I have concerns though, because there's a lot of actions like we've talked about that do reduce costs over time, but may increase costs right now. And I feel like that should also be considered. And not necessarily saying that that's the most important thing, but this is one criteria that we're looking at. And I think that would be rated maybe lower than an action that reduces costs today, as well as 10 years from now. So I do feel like adding that kind of limits it to only looking at, you know, a larger time scale, and we're kind of not looking at the impact right now for people.
Tess, did you have a comment to that?
Yeah, just in reaction, I get a little concerned about the squishiness of some of these categories when we add too much to the definitions. So like if you look at affordability and then you look at equity, part of the argument for keeping them separate seems to be that you can assess them separately. So the high barrier to entry, the kind of high costs in the short term, could be assessed under equity and lower that value versus the affordability, if of course there's only one item to assess under equity. And you know, that could also get complicated, but I don't know how perfect we can make these categories by making them more expansive, I guess is my concern.
Kirsty?
Yeah, that makes sense, Tess. What I kept coming back to is like, this is the value of having a committee of like, we're all going to view these slightly different and we all have different expertise. And like, I'm not going to separate equity from any of these, but others may. So I think I'm not too worried about that because I think the scoring will work that out. And then one suggestion I had here for the definition in response to Kavi was saying, and instead of over time, wording as an investment to the reduction of cost of living. So investment might mean spending more now, or it might be, you know, for the long term.
Investment in the reduction.
Yeah, and invest in the reduction of cost of living, or I don't know, might need some wordsmithing, but using the word investment instead of over time.
Do you think that would be added in the definition or in like the question, just so I can kind of capture it?
Yeah, I don't know. I'm interested. Kavi, what do you think of that in response to your concern?
I think it kind of changes the meaning of if you add that as a definition. I think it changes a little bit because then it kind of seems to target only certain actions that are more investment related versus non-investment actions. So I feel like I don't think that would go that far. If everyone's okay with it over time, I think that's fine. But I think personally, I think it limits the scope of the affordable living and affordability because then we're just looking at it in longer term scope and not what happens, you know, next year or so. So that was my only concern with over time, but I think if everyone's in favor of keeping that, that's fine too. It's not a deal breaker.
Well, we do have it in the queue in the question already. So, you know, if you want to keep it in that broader frame, we can remove it from the definition and keep it in the question. So, and again, this is for us to evaluate, right? And just making sure we're all on the same kind of the same wavelength, but not necessarily the same speed of that wavelength. So we're all kind of, and as you guys said, you know, we're all going to have little intricacies in how we're doing it. But as long as we are feeling comfortable with the general frame of reference and how we're tackling these, that's the main goal. So maybe guess a raise of hands who feels comfortable keeping over time in the definition. Put your Zoom hand up. Looks like we'll keep over time in the definition. We have a majority that feels comfortable with leaving that change in place. Kirsty?
What if we put immediately or over time? Immediately and or over time. It doesn't limit that.
Whether
I was
immediate.
going to say, we could say in the short or long term.
Yeah, or in the short or long term.
That's also similar to not specifying at all, though. So I just wasn't sure if that'd be helpful.
Okay. Well, that sounds like a good compromise for everybody. And it just, again, it's just reminding people to frame their thought process in these different kind of buckets. So
Like that. Did you guys want to make that change? I couldn't really tell.
I think, is anyone opposed to that change? Raise your hand. Okay, let's move on to community partnerships. Definition being organizations and businesses working in related sectors to the given action item with the ability to offer resources and expertise. The question posed, does this action item offer opportunities to collaborate with organization and businesses already working in the related industry? Raise your hand if you have any thoughts on this one or concerns or changes you would like to see. Covey?
A very small one. I was just thinking adding after collaborate with maybe benefit from and benefit from, because I think that's kind of part of the
And or
lens we're looking at it from. Yeah.
And probably make that
Everyone's okay
second
with
word plural also with that.
perfect. Great. Any other comments on this category that anyone wants to address? All right, let's move on to the next one. Other, and checking on time, I think we're doing pretty good. We had slated an hour for this, and so we're on our second page. Woohoo! Other significant co-benefits. The definition of this: items not currently listed under our criteria. Let me start over. Items not currently listed under our criteria, including but not limited to the co-benefits listed in the Community Climate Action Plan, such as economic vitality, supports the natural environment, community health and safety, adaptation, and resilience. So the question posed here, are there additional benefits connected to this action item? And I'll open the floor to any questions or comments. It's a quiet Zoom room. Rory?
This one kind of makes me think of synergy, which I know from other work I'm following at the city is there's an effort to, like, say, do capital spending and synergy, like the current Newport Road project is a good example, right? It's a stormwater project, but they're also using the opportunity to replace transportation facilities there. And it makes me think of the same thing with this one. So I wonder if we could sort of clarify what we're talking about here by adding that the action has synergy with other goals for the city, something like that. It's kind of, maybe that's too similar to missed opportunities, which we're about to get to, but something to think about.
Does anyone have any comments from Rory's point of view? I do agree. I think there's a place for it, but I also think it kind of falls in that missed opportunity a little bit. There's kind of, so Mark, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think I have the same perspective that Rory has. Just in my experience, when you can show that a project is in some way providing other benefits to other organizations, it's almost just this binary check, which just helps move things through the process, as opposed to worrying about the magnitude or the distribution. Here, it's just sort of a check that tends to be helpful politically.
So would it make sense to add something to the question? Are there additional benefits or synergy? I'm not best at ad hoc edits here. Something to that effect, or is there another way that you guys would like to pose that as a potential change?
I like that. I think it captures the concept.
Neil, can I call on you to finish? My daughter's school is calling. I need to answer.
Yep.
Sorry.
No worries. Okay, so we added that good buzzword. I think it's important, but I just laugh every time I hear synergy. Go ahead, Bill.
Yeah, it's the same thing. It's a big buzzword, but it works both ways too. I mean, there's oftentimes something that's happening on its own that will support an action that we want to accomplish, as the city wants to accomplish to reduce climate impacts. So it works. It's not only does the actions of the for climate help those, it works the other way to help the actions happen. So that's an important distinction, but it's all captured. That's good. It's an important criteria, and it'll get things done.
Great. So missed opportunities is the last one of our criteria. The failure to seek an opportunity. And does this action support an effort to avoid missed opportunities? What are the consequences of delaying action? A question that I have for the group as well is, I feel like some of these are the criteria that we're evaluating them on, and some of them we kind of keep in the back of our mind as principles that we'll continue to evaluate. So I imagine missed opportunities and some of these things as the kind of situations where they might come up and cause something to jump our original evaluation. So even if it doesn't come up now, it might come up in the future. Go ahead, Tess.
Sorry, may I just make a semantics request? The failure to capitalize on an opportunity, because it's more about something comes up and then you take advantage, right?
Yeah. I guess I didn't, the one above, I didn't leave that one open for any other comments. If there was anything else that we missed there. Mark, was your question on co-benefits or missed opportunities?
It was just sort of actually more general, and I think it relates to this and also some of the affordability dynamics, where I think implicitly the way I heard we're going to end up using this information or ranking is some kind of summation, which is functionally equally weighting each of these criteria. And I guess I would maybe pose to the group if we're comfortable with that, or if we even want to say implicitly do any weighting or explicitly weighting criteria. I can imagine how part of the debate over which things justify a full criteria is because we're trying to keep them equally weighted. And I bring that up here because this one does sort of relate to some of the other factors. And I don't know if that's complicating things too much to suggest that we might also consider, when we're doing our own ranking, indicate which criteria we think we would want to overweight or underweight. Does anyone have any concerns about that, or do we feel comfortable with equal weighting across criteria?
I think the weighting is incorporated, so we can weight that. I'm assuming that's why Tess raised her hand. But there is an element, Mark, that I'm hearing you as well, that whether it's in there or not, the number of categories that you have implicitly weight similar items higher, which is a challenge that the original CCAP group had in evaluating a ton of criteria and then feeling like the net result wasn't what they expected because they were looking at 10 things, but it was implicitly weighting the breadth of questions they were asking more than the specifics that they knew. So that weighting is a part of the evaluation criteria. So we should be able to counter that concern. So just bringing that back, are there other pieces beyond the additional things that we had for co-benefits first? I think we discussed it, but I just wanted to make sure. And then if not, other discussion or pieces for missed opportunities. All right, awesome. And Serena has to hop off for the rest of the call, but we can, just as a heads up, so we can move down to constraint if everybody is good with those, making good progress. As a reminder, this area was added as a kind of balancing force against the normal evaluation criteria. So the first one, community receptiveness, is how the community receives this action item. Is there any more background, or can somebody else summarize the constraints versus the evaluation, or the constraints versus the benefits better than I'm doing off top of hand, if that's necessary?
Tess, do you want to explain it? Since you and Serena kind of put together I also can as well, but you might be better at it.
I mean, I can explain how it works in the tool, which is kind of how I understand it best. But per Kavi's suggestion at the last meeting on this, basically what you'll get at the end of your evaluation, doing both the benefits and the constraints, you'll get 2 columns of information where per strategy or action item, you'll get a score for your benefit and a score for your constraint. And basically they're the inverse of each other. So a high constraint score is not good, a high benefit score is good, and you can kind of look at how to compare those things.
And I think big picture, the idea was that the evaluation criteria, they were all kind of like positives. Does this action item have that? And so the constraints was kind of meant to be like, what about those action items where they may be good, but they kind of have something, there's like a big but in there, like, but it's super expensive, or but this is going to be really hard for the community to kind of understand the benefits of. So that was why they originally proposed just like a subtraction, which we're not doing anymore. But the idea was to allow to factor those types of considerations in as well, or at least look at them.
Yeah. And these don't mean that something's not going to be, prioritized. It's just a factor that's considered and weighting that factor kind of collectively as a group. So those are community receptiveness, or we can start with community receptiveness. So how the community receives this action item. One question that I have for the constraints, and this is, do constraints just have to be what level of negative they are, and for the benefits, what level of positive they are? And if so, my thought would be that community receptiveness would need to be more inherently negative. If something has a ton of community receptiveness, I don't know how that would be weighted.
Yeah, Tess kind of just tried to explain it. I think because originally, since it was set up as a subtraction, we were trying to figure this out too. Like, but yes, I think you're right about that. And that's why the question was like, will there need to be additional effort? Because if the number is high on the constraints, that means there's like a lot of constraints. So if there's a ton of community receptiveness, then maybe that would be 0, because then it basically, it's not counting against it. So if you want to change it to like community opposition or something, or might make it a little bit more intuitive, or you would do changes like that.
Kavi, go ahead.
Yeah, I think one thing I was thinking for definition is changing it to make it more of like the effort required to get community support or something along those lines, to get the community to be receptive to it if it's not already, but phrasing it in a way for definition, and maybe also the title of it that kind of mirrors what Cassie was saying.
How do other folks feel about that proposed change? Not seeing any big reactions. Do you want to say that again so we can have kind of Cassie can have a draft to, or she looks like she has that started.
Yeah, so I don't know what the title would be still. I'm still trying to figure out if anyone else has any thoughts.
That's not like beautiful language, but I think it gets it across. But if anyone has any suggestions.
I thought the language is, the constraint is fine. The title of it seems fine. It just says that that's the constraint. And then the definition is how much are we going to have to work to get, how much work's going to have to be done to get the support for it. And so if a high score is negative, so that seems to be working.
Yeah.
Either constraint title is fine. That's maybe a little more clear the way you got it now. But that was a good call on making sure that they're all parallel. A high score equals bad ish.
Other thoughts on this? I personally really like the new definition. I think it gives a little bit more direction and clarity, and I'm happy with either titles. I think community receptiveness could work as well. So then it's not just the same thing over. It's challenging to have your definition the same as your title. Does that seem like it would be a challenge for anybody if we had community receptiveness with the definition being the effort required to gain community support for this action item?
I could see there being potential for misunderstanding maybe, but I agree with you, Neil, that you don't have to put the whole definition in the definition, but I wonder if there's a way to put that in 2 words.
Yeah,
That's
it's
more clear.
Or an alternate title that is a little bit more directed.
We could call the title, I don't know if we want to use this word, but you could call it community opposition, but I don't know. I don't know if that brings in like an overly negative term.
That's what Kersey thumbs up. Peter, did you have another idea as well?
What about adding just initial community receptiveness?
Because then that seems like a more targeted constraint.
Just for the title piece, my hope would be that if we are doing our job well, that over time there isn't going to be the concern with community receptiveness, but right off the bat, you can kind of, the constraint is initially how the community receives it, right?
All right. I'm going to try to move on by getting a show of hands of either initial community receptiveness or community opposition. Those are the 2 ideas that we have. So I'll give you a second to think about which one you prefer. And since it sounds like we agree on definition and question. What was that, Kathy?
I call it potential community opposition, okay, so that it's a little bit,
yep.
Yeah.
Okay, so think about which one you want between the 2. And then I'm going to people that support initial community receptiveness, raise your Zoom hand.
Sorry, Neil, could I?
No. Okay, and then lower your hands, and then potential community opposition, raise your Zoom hand. Covey, which one were you?
I had another idea. I don't know, it might be too late to offer it now, but it was going to be difficulty gathering community support.
That's a good one.
I got it just a couple seconds delayed.
Well, the votes I think we're pretty tied as well. I'm open to other considerations of how to. I'd like to move forward, but I don't know what to do next. Bill? Oh, Cassie?
I'd support what Kavi suggested. That's pretty good.
What was your compromise, Kavi?
It was difficulty gathering community support, because I think that's what we're trying to measure, is how difficult it's going to be to get the community support.
Slightly different than the definition, not as negative, descriptive. Okay, raise your hand if that works for you. Okay, that's a majority of people. Moving on. Okay, great work. We have just two more. Level of funding, financial resources needed to implement the action. This is a constraint that was, that was brought up and is an important one. Kavi, go ahead. Or lower your Zoom hands if you're done voting and want to comment on level of funding. I know, like a lot of these, some of these, including funding and like staff time, are things that will need to be, are a part of the action going forward, is actually evaluating how large that is. Some of it was in the CCAP, and some of it will just be, we won't know until the project actually starts. So we don't have firm numbers to make all of these decisions on, but that's kind of a next stage. Is that clear for everybody? Great. And then resources, time, and effort. Non-financial resources needed to implement this action item. Staff time, materials, planning time, implementation time, outreach, etc. And this is one where hopefully, if there were questions about it, we could at least get an idea of in our work with Cassie and other people at the city for estimates on this item. Mark, go ahead.
I don't think this is an issue, just clarification. Are we thinking of these as both for funding and resources, city specific or community wide? I'm assuming community wide. And I don't know if that distinction matters or not. I don't think it needs to, but just raising that.
Do people have thoughts of city specific or community wide? Chrissy?
I think community wide, because we're including community partners in a lot of the work, and the city is not the lead on all of the action items. So we can clarify that. Staff time being city and the community or something like that.
Do people feel like that needs to be added into the description, or is that just an understanding that we have as a group? Bill?
I think it needs to be added.
Okay.
I was having the same question about it when the words staff time means city to me, and so I think we need to add something in there like for other groups, outside group time or partner time. Yeah, just so we capture that, because it isn't just city time on some of these.
Yeah. Does that across the community make sense or work for folks? I think, obviously these are broadly evaluated across the community, and then we will have the very specific of the ones the city is in control of. We'll have a level of funding, limitation on those, but the implementation or the evaluation is broader than that to begin with. So, okay. Are there any comments on level of funding or resource, time, and effort with these modifications? Go ahead, Bill.
Well, I'm just going to say, really, this is all about level of effort, and period. I mean, when you think about it in the bigger picture, you got an action that's got a lot of, we can get a lot from, but it takes a big level of effort. That's what we're really trying to get at with this. So I think this captures it really well.
Great. Anybody else? Leave it open for comment for a little bit. Okay. So let's, Cassie, if you want to just go back up to the top, is there anything that it seems like we need to come back and readdress? Like we contradicted ourselves going through these changes? If we want to just scroll slowly through what changes we made. Hyphenated low-hanging fruit, I don't think that's contradicted now, so I think that's good. And then once, if there's any comments or other thoughts on these changes, then we can entertain a motion with the voting members present. Go ahead, Tess.
Sorry, I don't want to throw a wrench in things by suggesting something, but looking through these items, one constraint that might not have been covered by other items is a vulnerability to changes in politics or funding over time. If a project has to be implemented over a long period of time or maintained over a long period of time, if there's a change in the city council or larger politics at play, whether that project has a vulnerability or not. If it's encompassed in any other category, feel free to voice that, but I feel like it's missing.
Do you think that that's a really interesting consideration? Do you think that that could be somehow included in the first constraint of like, you know, no, Bill says no. Okay, but just that these this support both from leaders and the community can change over time is the question. So are there other thoughts on that? Should we add that as a different one? I think that's a I agree, it's an open question and one that I don't think we need to, I think that we can be intentional as a group, and I'm not sure how we could and should address it without kind of beating around the bush of what is their political will and community support. Those can be separate things, and how this would be an open discussion for how the group thinks that we should consider that. Are they different? Is an open question. Rory.
I don't think they're that different, and I would support adding that idea into this community support one. You know, in theory and most of the time in practice, our political leadership represents the interests of the community. So I see them as somewhat similar in that it would fit here.
Other thoughts? Cubby?
I had a question. So are we talking about, or is the idea to just add community and political support right there in the definition of that, and then removing community from the title? Is that what the idea is? Or are we still talking about adding a different constraint item? Or is that the discussion we're having?
So that's the discussion we're having.
I would support adding it in and keeping it one constraint, because I do think it's an important one, but I don't think it'll apply to everything, because I think it only applies to like longer term things that may be taken away, like in the middle of implementation. So I think it's worth considering that, but I just want to be mindful of having a constraint that may not apply to every single action.
Rory, do you think that community support is encompassing of that elected officials are a part of the community, or do you think that we need to specifically say, specifically call something else out?
I mean, yeah, that's kind of what I'm getting at. I think community encompasses the leaders we elect to lead our community, but I would also be fine clarifying like the effort required to gain community and political support. That's fine with me.
Kelly?
I just wanted to take it back to Tess. Is that is something that you brought up? Is that something that you think is captured in there? Or are you asking to have it added within the constraint?
Yeah, thanks, Kelly. I think it was more just putting it to the brain trust of the group and putting it out there for interpretation. So if folks are thinking about it when they're evaluating. So I'm happy with whatever the group decides in terms of the semantics of it, but keep it in, keep it out, but so long as it's out there.
And Tess, do you think that the need is the political support piece or the overtime piece?
Yeah, I think the key is probably the overtime piece, right? And to Kavi's point, it's not necessarily applicable to every project or implementation item. So I certainly see the benefit to wrapping it into something else.
And I'll also just mention, deciding all of these definitions is important, but the group conversation now, as opposed to once we've all evaluated and then are defending why we did this, is very valuable. So go ahead, Bill, and then Kelly.
So I just wanted to ask Tess, are you thinking about, for example, vulnerability to like a state or a state regulation overriding something that Bend as a community adopts? I mean, is that part of the vulnerability that like a state mandate would change? We couldn't, yeah, like the code, for example, set at the state level. We come up with something in Bend and then, oh, no, guess you can't do that. Is that separate enough to be different constraint? Is that what you were thinking or part of what you were thinking?
Yeah, I think you're certainly fleshing out my very superficial thought here. So you've already taken it a little bit deeper than I had when I suggested it. So I don't have a ready answer for you, I guess.
All right, go ahead, Kelly.
Yeah, and also totally not superficial. This is a super helpful discussion. So thank you for bringing it up, Tess. I would just add that elections are static, right? They occur on a set cadence of time, whereas demographics, constituents, just evolution on certain topics is very dynamic. And so while we want the community to include our elected officials, and they should be a reflection of how the community is, our current mindset, that may not be evolving on this at the same progress or timeline. And so I think calling it out separately may be helpful in that case.
And with that, Kelly, are you proposing that being calling it out separately in the definition or in a separate constraint?
No, in the constraint. In the same constraint as community, just calling it out separately. Perfect.
Kirsty?
Yeah, as Tess was explaining it, I think if we had our previous city council or just a more conservative city council, we would be thinking about this a lot more and want to be mindful of that. And just vulnerable, I like the word vulnerable to, if there's a recession or a natural disaster, would this action item be greatly affected? So beyond politics as well. So in that line of thinking, it might be a new constraint, but just wanting to kind of broaden even my own head of I think I haven't been thinking about this because we're not worried about this current council, and maybe we should be thinking beyond that. And as our population grows here, that might shift our politics and bend. So it might be worth entertaining that idea. Thanks for bringing it up, Tess.
Just a quick time check, Neil, that we have about 4 minutes until 1 o'clock. So we also need to decide if we're ready to adopt these or not in part of that 4 minutes.
Well, I would really like to get to a point where we could adopt these in the next 4 minutes, and am open to some really fast, well fleshed out proposals from the group. So that is the request, and open question for the group too, of wanting to get there, if that's a want, not a need. Percy, go ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, I think prioritizing moving this forward is important to me as well. So I think adding in or assuming the understanding that community also means our elected officials is okay for me to move forward today, because we've had this conversation. So I would be comfortable with voting as it is.
Great.
Okay, not enough time, but I wanted to just propose adding a new criteria for the benefit side, and I'll just read through it, and then we can see if you have time to discuss it or not, or if it doesn't make sense. So the title would be Culture Shift. The definition would be changing beliefs, behaviors, and outcomes as they relate to sustainability. And the question would be, does this action help create a culture shift towards sustainability in the community? And the reason I think I wanted to add that is I don't think any of the other benefits really captured that part of it, which is changing people's behaviors and attitudes towards what we're trying to do as a whole. Brief.
Can you just say the definition again real quick?
It's changing beliefs, behaviors. There it is. I had emailed it.
Okay, I'm gonna split this up into 2 pieces. Thank you, Covey, for bringing that up, because that was an open piece of this conversation too. Was making sure that all of those were in there. Can I get somebody to propose a solution for the community support piece, a modification to the definition, or Kersey's proposal that we understand that includes a political piece? Covey, do you want to propose something there? Or your hand's still raised? Okay. Bill?
I guess I hate to not be explicit, because this is actually a document that is not just for us.
Right.
So I think we need maybe just, if we don't make a separate constraint, then we need to add back in the piece about political support. But that doesn't really get to the vulnerability part, I think.
Could we use the effort required to gain community and political support over time for this action item? So we add the time and the political piece to that?
Sure, that makes it more understandable, I think. I'm
seeing general nods.
Yeah.
Any modifications to that piece? Okay, great. And then the culture shift piece, Covey, I do want to address. I know that we're at time, but that's an open question for the group. If I don't, process-wise, I'm not sure how to go forward if we have, that's just what people.
Can we do a simple vote? Just raise hand if you approve.
Yeah. Oh, sure. That sounds great.
I make the motion to approve culture shift as it is.
Okay, you need a second, so I'll second it.
Okay. I saw hands of all voting members, so I think that that's in there. And I think that we have talked through all of the other pieces. Is there any, I'm looking for a motion to approve
Can I make
these definitions, but want to make sure before we do that motion that if there's any last minute comments that need to happen, so we don't need to modify it. So we have this list. It's been updated by Cassie as we've been talking. We've all had an opportunity to look at it. Are there any other comments before we make a motion? Okay, not seeing any motions or not seeing any comments. Somebody would like to make a motion.
I'll make a motion to approve all the changes.
I'll second.
All right, raise your Zoom hands. Bill, are you voting? I don't see a Zoom hand if you're intending to. Okay, great. All right, all members present, approved. Nice work, team. The important next steps, just as a reminder of homework, the next piece is what we're going to be talking about going forward, which is how these actually get into the things that we're sending to council. Next steps, which we'll email as a reminder after this meeting, is using these evaluation criteria. I know some groups still have meetings, but it's getting those back in 1 week for Cassie to be able to aggregate for our public meetings. Are there any last minute comments and or things that need to be added to or considered for the next agenda?
I think the COID thing that Kelly had mentioned on the bike rack, if we can add that to next week's agenda or next month's.
Perfect. Thank you.
Mine's a question.
Go ahead, Bill. I wasn't sure.
So the next step, the spreadsheet's gonna get sent out with all the changes made to it sometime in the next day or two. Is that, since we have?
Yeah, well, I'll try to get that sent out. If not by the end of the day today, I'll do it by midday tomorrow. And then on the CYD topic, we obviously don't have time to get into it now, but for that meeting, maybe we'll have, I'll talk with Mary and we'll give maybe just a couple of minutes of background, but I think it's important to understand that there's not actually a decision point for the city at this time that can be influenced. So I think we don't have time to talk about the nuances of it, but we can spend a few minutes kind of explaining where that's at, previous decisions that have been made. I don't know, Mary, if you want to add something.
Yeah, would you like an email with some background now? Yeah, and we were really out of time, but kind of bigger picture, forgetting this project, but other projects, if any project affects natural resources, and really they all do because it's vacant land and we're developing, right? Whether it's within the city or in the urban growth boundary, for this body to weigh in, you really would have to have a grounding in long-range planning and current planning and understand those processes so that you know the context when people write you. Other committees that have wanted to weigh in on land use matters have Brian Rankin from our growth management department, Colin start to understand that system. It's a complicated and a big project for you to take on, but you really need to not just look at one project in isolation, no matter what the issue is, but to understand, which may be something you want to know better. I mean, that maybe is if I were putting this in the parking lot, I probably wouldn't say COID as much as I would say, do you want to understand the numerous land use decisions that are going to affect the natural environment that people may write you about? And what do you all know about the comp plan update, what housing that we're doing, what all this land that's going to be developed, what are the parameters? Do you all want to understand that? And if you do, that's an agenda item that is a lot longer than we have now to talk about.
I was just gonna say, I think the important thing to know is for what you've been receiving emails about, there's nothing time sensitive that that the city has the ability to influence really whatsoever. So it's, if we don't have time to talk about it now, and we'll talk about it a little bit next month, and we can definitely talk about it further. And like Mary said, it's definitely a much bigger conversation, but just rest assured, you're not missing an opportunity to make an important difference right now. Just unfortunately. Sorry, Mary, I didn't mean to cut you off.
It's okay. No, it's okay. I mean, but again, whether this one's urgent or not, it's all in a much bigger context.
Yeah.
That to make an educated recommendation, you would have to understand and want to take on as part of your committee's work.
And Kelly, or as another piece of that too, the responding to people's requests policy we can bring back up at the next meeting as well, because I'm glad you brought that up.
And we will send out a little bit more background on this topic over email.
Yeah. All right. We're over time. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, everybody. Thanks for all your great work. Kirsty is exactly right. This might seem tedious now, but in 2 years when there's a new council, in 4 years when there's a new council, you're just doing great work. So thanks, everybody.
Covey, did you have a last comment, or did you want to make the motion to adjourn?
Motion to adjourn.
Great.
Second.
Second. Vote by leaving the meeting.